Stop the presses, everybody. A 6,000 plus story has been unearthed and revealed, and Eli has the story. Eli?
Well, in a couple of different archaeology stories, we're looking at some findings that some claim legitimize the story of Noah's Ark and Utnapishtim and Ziusudra and Artrahasis and Manu and Deucalion. The first is a look at findings from a ground-penetrating radar analysis from the Durupinar site in Turkey, where a co-lead researcher, Andrew Jones, and he alone, says that this just couldn't be naturally formed. It must have been constructed. And the second is the Imago Mundi, which is regarded as the oldest known map of the world, as it was understood by the Babylonians 3,000 years ago, which seems to give clues to the final resting place of the fabled watercraft. Of course, this is from the Gilgamesh version. These articles are from the U.S. Sun by Juliana Cruz Lima on October 19th, 2024, and the Jerusalem Post by Jerusalem Post staff on October 30th, 2024.
I like to just say shout out to my Star Trek TNG fans. Gilgamesh at Uruk. Sorry, I couldn't help it. Oh my goodness. So Eli, you actually brought the story up to us. So what do you make of the ongoing quest to find Noah's Ark, particularly in light of the recent discoveries of I believe it's the Durupinar formation? I'm pretty sure I butchered that. And shout out to you for saying all those words that I have never used in my life, and you actually saying it correctly. So kudos to you.
So I spent a little bit of time looking into, I wanted to figure out about this research project. It is at the Durupinar site is what I heard it called. It is in Turkey. And so this project is being primarily funded and operated logistically by the Doubting Thomas Research Foundation, which I'm sure you guessed is a religious organization. And their goal is to find archaeological evidence for biblical history. So Andrew Jones is the co-lead researcher on this project. And with him, his other co-lead researcher is a Dr. Yüksel, who is a Turkish local. He is an actual scientist, and his role primarily consists of operating the scientific equipment, obtaining permits, analyzing the data, and then telling Andrew Jones what the data means for Andrew Jones to then go on and extrapolate wildly from there with claims that basically nobody else supports. So I did look into Andrew Jones. He does seem to have no public record of any academic, educational, or professional background in any field whatsoever. So that was sort of the details I was able to gather so far about like the actual Durupinar, the site where he's claiming there are these remains of what he claims to be Noah's Ark.
No academic credentials whatsoever?
That I could find.
Shaka, when the walls fell. Jimmy, you talked a bit about a huge timeline to extract from, but not necessarily unique to the hypothesis. Can you expand on it a little bit more?
Yeah, so they are the proponents of this idea that this may be Noah's Ark are saying, well, there's evidence of human activity there. They found marine animals that could not have possibly gotten up to that top of that mountain without human help. Okay. Humans eat marine animals. Humans might take these things places. Also, they're talking about a time gap of between 1,500 and 2,000 years of when those marine animals could have been deposited. We know that people lived in that area back then and well before it. We know that the climate changed, and it quite possibly could have been the case that marine animals were able to get closer to the top of that formation earlier in the Earth's history. For example, the Sahara Desert about 9,000 years ago, it was a plain. It was, an agricultural center. There were streams and rivers. It was not a sandy kind of frontier. So there's really no evidence supporting these people's claims, and plenty of evidence suggesting all types of other scenarios in which these things could have happened. Plus, I think it's really important to note that when we're talking about evidence, multiple sources say that this is a natural rock formation. Like, this is not this. Where's the wood that it was built out of? Like, there's no tests come back conclusively, or even close to being conclusively that this was somehow a man-made structure.
Yeah, I think that we have like a running theme with both articles, with a lot of claims with not, basically like the preponderance of evidence that actually is going to like bring it up, right? But I want to come to you, Eli, because you also had like some more information specifically about the second article concerning the Ziusudra, which was actually way before Gilgamesh. So Timba, his arms open wide. Give us, please, more about Ziusudra.
Yeah, so Ziusudra, as I understand it, is essentially the oldest version of the Great Flood narrative, the boat builder narrative. And I did really quick want to add to your point, Jimmy, as far as like marine animals being in these like high altitude areas, there's marine limestone at the top of Mount Everest, like the
Right.
composition of
Yeah.
the rock. So like, yeah, at a certain point, it's absolutely plausible that all of that was underwater. But yeah, so Ziusudra being like the oldest version, so the Imago Mundi is the second article, is what that's focusing on, which is just a sort of clay tablet that has a map on it and some inscriptions and it seems to give clues about the resting place of the boat that was built in the Ziusudra version of the flood narrative. And this is really just kind of evidence like this story has been floating around, if you can, forgive the pun, floating around since the Sumerians wrote Ziusudra. This is way before Gilgamesh, as you pointed out. And so I'm 100% prepared to believe that this myth has been evolving and carrying on from way early times. And yeah, 3,000 years ago, they probably had a version. They probably had some version that there's a few different versions even that claim to know where the boat landed and where it used to be. And it wasn't there at that point either, probably. So it doesn't seem, it's being presented, I guess, as sort of like evidence of the truth of the narrative when it's really just evidence of the existence of the narrative.
I think that is an appropriate thing to say concerning these stories, because like even when you are mentioning the organization that's funding these archaeological digs and things of that nature, it's a religious organization, right? The Doubting Thomas, it reminds me of the unless I can see the hands where the nail prints were and the piercing on his side, I will not believe. Blessed are ye, Thomas, that have seen me, but blessed are those who have not seen me and yet still believe. That was my Shatner impersonation of doing the Bible. How did that work? No. I was going through the whole Star Trek thing. Regardless, Jimmy, you talked about some of the things in your article. You brought up like a couple of websites that you were mentioning, I believe, like about popular mechanics and also about the era at the formation of the volcanic activity. Did you want to talk a little bit more about that as well?
Sure. This is not something that has not been studied. Okay. This is something that people who consider themselves to be professionals have looked into. Multiple studies have been done about this area when it comes to geologic activity and, kind of evolution, if you will. Plenty of evidence points to the fact that these are natural formations, and that there are areas in that part of the world that we can point to that create mountain chains based on volcanic activity. And we are just looking at that. Ironically, it made the shape of some kind of boat. Okay. And then that leads people to jump up and say, aha, because when we deal with people who have a story or have a conviction about something that doesn't have much evidence to it or any evidence at all, they'll look for ways to confirm their own biases. They approach potential evidence with a confirmation bias, right? And they make sense of things out of things that are really nonsensical or don't really require a lot of thought. But if we go to the professionals, popularmechanics.com, a couple of other geologic sites I checked into, I posted some of these, there are people out there actively trying to get to the bottom of it, not because they want to prove people wrong, because the truth is important. And you can't just have this myth, this folklore that tells you something and not investigate it. That's not how anything works. And so I don't think it should work. It shouldn't work with religion. And so we have an obligation to point to the things that counter these arguments, especially when these arguments are incredibly weak.
Yeah, I think this is kind of like on the. It may be a bit off-putting, but well, not necessarily off-putting, but a little bit strained when you talk about people like taking like different connections into patterns that they happen to see and coming up with certain conclusions. I believe that's called apophenia, if I'm not mistaken. Apophenia is the tendency to perceive meaningful connections between unrelated things. And it's kind of like in the process of like how we actually look at patterns, right? So like, say for instance, all of us have been told the story about Noah's Ark, especially like if you grew up Christian or if you grew up in some type of Abrahamic religion influence, right? So if we happen to not only hear the story, but believe the story, when we go out to seek more evidence to corroborate the story, we're going to look at all types of different patterns, all types of different, formations, as you mentioned, Jemmy, and I come to this particular conclusion that, that's the boat.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's the boat right there, even though like, if you really look at it at a scientific level concerning a worldwide flood, there is possibly no way that the entire world could have flooded with water and then receded and then, all of a sudden like ended up on the top of Mount Sinai. We don't have enough atmospheric water between, the gaseous state and even our oceans to even do that. And then a lot of times when people talk about, well, there's been stories around the world about, worldwide floods. I said, there have been stories about worldwide floods, yes, but please keep this in context that you're talking about people who were only aware of the geographical location that they were in at that particular time. These are not people who were going all over to the Western Hemisphere, to the Antarctic, to the Arctic Circle, and back again in order for them to observe these things, let alone being able to have access to technology to be able to actually visually see these things as far as like using a satellite or things of that nature, so that they can actually see if there are areas that happens to be flooding, or if you have like oceans that happen to be absorbing more water to the point that it's actually hitting land, right? So I think that this with the Doubting Thomas Society and also talking about Gilgamesh at Uruk. I'm sorry. Listen, guys, I live long and prosper. I am going to be utilizing this whole particular segment to actually be going on Darmark and Jalar to Tanagra. My bad. But if I get back to the serious part, that's what we're dealing with here. We're dealing with, people who are scientists, air quotes, with unfoundable academic credentials to say this is a thing. Yet, I would be curious to know, and I think that I would like for both of you all to chime in with your final thoughts about this. If these people were probed by actual skeptics who happen to be in the scientific community, who are actual archaeologists, paleontologists, people who actually studied these things, geologists who are actually very much so aware of how rocks form and how volcanic eruptions could have actually been contributed to these things as well, how they would react and where their answers would lie, or if they were appropriate these particular questions, if they were just completely obfuscate anything that would be something that would actually give credence to what they have found. Do you think that would be a thing or no? And how do you think it would go? So Eli, I would like for you to just ponder, conjecture that, and then Jimmy, I would like for you to also come back with that as well.
Yeah, well, it is on record that Dr. Yerksel, which is Andrew Jones's partner, his research partner, who the actual geophysicist with a specialty in geophysical engineering that operates the machinery, he does not agree with Andrew Jones's interpretation of the findings. And that is on the record. He has been verbally, his ideas have been verbally outright rejected by geologists, archaeologists, anthropologists, and other geophysicists apart from his own partner. So it's not we don't have to ponder like how would this go. We know that like no experts that do have verifiable public records of professional, academic, or educational backgrounds in some field that is relevant, they say no, that's a natural formation, just like Jimmy pointed out at the beginning.
I think
they say nah.
I think in order to convince or cause somebody who takes such a staunch position that this is proof of their folklore, in order to do that and change their mind or even challenge their view, you would have to really isolate them and make them listen to you. So I think I've seen this actually happen. Being in the military, Eli, maybe you were in the military, so maybe you can relate. But when you're deployed and you're sent somewhere where you're not used to, you kind of bond with people that are not at all like you, and then you start to like pick up each other's habits, mimic each other's behaviors, maybe talk about things and understand things from their perspective. In this scenario, when you have archaeologists that are so well trained and so expert in their field saying this is wrong, the people that are purporting, these falsehoods to be correct can just turn around and go back to their flock. When you're isolated, you can't do that. Right. And when you're in a position where you can't turn back to your flock, you have to hear the facts. And sometimes that might be effective. Other times it might just be a means of survival. But, or getting your needs met. How many people go to prison and change? It's something that you do because the environment calls for it. You go in and you're more religious. You go in and you were never racist before, but now you hate everybody that's not like you, and you just kind of have to do it. And I think in certain scenarios, when you force people to kind of think about things differently, that might be the only way. But given the freedom to go back to their indoctrinated group, they're going to stay indoctrinated. So you would literally probably have to cuff them to a table and be like, if you want this Coke can, you're going to listen to my story and you're going to listen to my science. I don't know. But I would say it's not going to be an easy feat.
Yeah, I think that at the end of the day, it's really about like taking the things that you are believing and then trying to do your best to get corroborating evidence to feed into your belief. And I think that what's really happening here is that what was actually found just like reinforced the myths and also the symbolic expressions of what they believe. And not necessarily, really with real, literal accounts of historical events. Even though that we can possibly say that we can put biblical myths and legends, or even like Babylonian myths and legends, etc., into a category of historical events because they were told in the past, it's still not necessarily something that I believe that we should necessarily give credence to as actual fact. And shout out to at least to the geologist that was with Andrew Jones that actually told him like, look, bro, I know you really want to believe this, but your theory is full of shit.
It feels really exploitative, honestly. It feels like, because he's a local, Andrew Jones moves to Turkey and finds a local to, speak to the locals, get the permits, operate the equipment, lend scientific legitimacy to his project, and then completely ignore his actual input because his respect for his knowledge falls just short of actually listening to him.
That is a powerful credence to indoctrination, people. It is. But if you, dear viewer, are still a skeptic and not given into indoctrination or other biblical myths or Gilgamesh at Uruk, click here.